So, hello everyone, welcome. I hope you're as excited as I am to welcome Governor Howard Dean to speak to us. Howard Dean was Governor of Vermont from 1991 to 2003, and then the chair of the DNC from 2005 to 2009. And I hope he'll be speaking to us about his own interest in our party and also in liberal politics more generally. So, Howard.
Thank you very much. I got involved in the Liberal Democrats early on because a friend of mine was their consultant. I actually did a fundraiser for them before Nick Clegg ascended to his exalted position. He was the chair of the party, but he was in a party that had, as you do now, a very small number of seats in Parliament. So I came over, I did a fundraiser for him, and we talked about strategic advice and so forth. And as soon as I found out where there were going to be debates, I knew he would do well because he is obviously a more attractive, charismatic person than Gordon Brown and who was the conservative candidate at the time? I can't even remember.
David Cameron.
David Cameron. Yes, no wonder. Easy to forget. I became, and he went into coalition, and I think Nick is a wonderful human being, but he made some two key mistakes. It was a good idea for him to go into coalition because the party hadn't been in power for 75 years, and there's a lot to learn when you're haven't been in power for that long. I think the critical mistakes were, one, when you agree to something, circumstances change, and you have to be willing to say that. British politicians, and particularly Nick, are mostly pretty honorable people, certainly more so than American politicians. But I think Nick had to go to Cameron and say, after the 3-year period, I'm really sorry, this isn't going to work out, and we're going to have to bring you down. Because then he got tagged with all the things the Conservatives did. And the other obvious mistake was the university tuition mistake. And that was just an enormous mistake. And the Liberal Dems have never recovered. And they missed the great chance to recover in the last election when Labor had a disastrous leader and they weren't able to take advantage of that. One of the biggest problems that the Liberal Democrats have is the first past the post system. There's no real way to get into the majority status without an enormous amount of money and name recognition. Clegg provided that during the debates when he really seriously outgunned the other two more establishment positions. And I thought the Lib Dems were poised to continue to do very, very well after they got 57 seats, but that wasn't to be. And then, of course, everything was overwhelmed by Brexit. I do think the Liberal Dems probably could have come back, but again, it was just too very, very difficult. Corbyn was incredibly polarizing. And people your age, I think, were very much turned off. I had my teaching assistant last year at Yale was a Brit who's probably not much older than you, and she swore that she'd never vote for a Liberal Democrat as a result of the university tuition issue. So, what to do to rekindle? First of all, luck is always involved, but given the first past the post system, you almost have to make an alliance with other parties, probably including Labor, and you have to have the kind of an agreement that was sort of not very well tried out, but at least thought of in the last election, where some of the other left center parties agree not to run somebody in a particular district, and you have the field to yourself, so you become the only opposition to the Conservatives. And if you can't do that, it's going to be incredibly hard for a minority party with only 15 seats to grow because the first past the post system is so incredibly undemocratic, much as our electoral system is in College of Electors is in the United States. So that would be the first thing. The other problem you're going to have is that Keir Starmer appears to be much more reasonable and more centrist than Corbyn. And it's very hard for a minor party to do well when there's not much political breathing room. Now, his party is probably more to his left than you might imagine, but Corbyn had an incredibly high negative rating. there was no way he was going to be the prime minister under any circumstances. I mean, I'm center left. I wouldn't have voted for Corbyn no matter what. And I really don't like the Conservatives at all. And I certainly don't like Johnson, but because I think he's just a Trump version of Trump goes to Eton. There was no way I was, I was, in the last election, I couldn't have brought myself to vote for Corbyn. Now, since I'm temperamentally inclined towards the Liberal Democrats anyway, it wouldn't have been a problem, and I would have voted for the Liberal Democrats. But it's very, very difficult in your system if you're not one of the two major parties. And so that's the long-term rebuild, is to make deals with Labor or whoever you have to make deals with so that you don't run it. So fairly similar ideological people don't run against each other. That means going into coalition with them when you win or when they win. And you really have to do that. You're going to have to rebuild your identity as a party. And I'm not there, so I don't know all the polling data, which I'm sure is incredibly interesting. I still think there's a very important place for a party that is more conservative on economic issues and more liberal on social issues. The quintessential moderate party, and it is a very pro-Europe party. I think one of the good things is that, as often is the case in politics, the pendulum will swing. And after Brexit takes place, I suspect strongly that the economic consequences are going to be appalling for Britain, for everybody except even the bankers. They'll be appalling for, who I'm sure usually vote for the Tories. And there's going to be some unrest in the electorate again. If it appears that Johnson is dead set on crashing out. Nobody's doing any serious negotiation. Partly that's Johnson's fault. Partly that's because of the coronavirus is occupying everybody on both sides of the English Channel's politics. And partly it's because the EU really is in trouble as well. They're fumbling around. They haven't really done the things they have to do. They cannot continue to let Poland and Hungary continue to develop into fascist states. Macron, who I have a lot of respect for, really screwed up when he decided not to let North Macedonia in, and then sort of recanted, realizing his stupidity. And the EU, they've made mistake after. I'm a huge fan of the EU's in principle, because I think it probably the most important example of advancing the humankind, the agenda of the humankind, the positive agenda of humankind, since in government since the Constitution of the United States, which established the idea that the government works for the public rather than the other way around. What the EU does is essentially try to get rid of nationalism and religion as a form of as an incitement to war, which is an incredible achievement. But we have human failings, and the European Union, their members of parliament often have human failings, and for them, for example, to just refuse to disclose their expenditures is just ridiculous. And I can't understand why they're doing it, because if you don't disclose in politics, people immediately suspect that you have something to hide. So they've got enormous problems, and I don't think they're going to be fixed. In fact, I actually think that if they can't deal with Orban and the PIS in Poland, that the European Union is really in great danger of contracting even more. So the European Union could conceivably end up being basically the Dutch, the northern countries, the Germans, and who knows who else, Austrians and so forth. But I mean, Italy and Spain, because I don't think Spain or Portugal is interested. But I mean, the Italians are not that far from dropping out, which of course would end them up in bankruptcy, but never seem to worry anybody in Italy. So that's my look at things. About European politics. Of course, we're going to end up talking about the coronavirus. I do have a medical background, which is going to be helpful, and I'm spending a lot of time with public health experts here. And I'm happy to talk about American politics or any other subject that you like, and I dare say I'll get a good interrogation from your leadership here.
I think we'll stay in because there's something you said that I found very interesting. You said that the most obvious path to electoral viability for the Lib Dems is to form an alliance with the Labour Party. Do you think Labour would be a more natural party for the Lib Dems?
Okay, I'm having a little trouble. You're breaking up a little bit. Do I think Labour would be interested in an alliance with the Lib Dems?
Mm-hmm.
only in districts that were marginal that they thought one of the phenomena that happens in a first past the post system with 3 or 4 viable parties is that one becomes the spoiler for the other. So there must be districts in which Lib Dems are spoilers for the Labor Party. There's where the accommodation can be, and it's not going to happen in a single election. In fact, if I were running the Liberal Democratic Party, I'd probably look at some by-elections first. There will be districts where people resign, and there'll be districts where the combined Liberal Democrats and Labor might win and overcome a conservative, but the conservative could win with 40% of the vote. So those are ideal districts where you want to make an alliance, and that would have to be negotiated. But obviously, part of the negotiation is which districts do you get to run in, and there has to be a tough negotiation. And what's at stake for them is more seats, and what is at stake for you is the repositioning yourself as a powerful party in British politics.
So we're getting a lot of questions, I think, understandably, about American politics. And one which I thought would be quite interesting is, because I imagine this is something we'll be hearing a lot about in the coming weeks, if you were Joe Biden, who would you be interested in selecting as your running mate?
I haven't seen a bad idea yet, and I don't really know. What goes into that, there's 2 things. One, of course, the first criteria is always, can this person be President of the United States? That's particularly important when you have a 78-year-old candidate. Joe will be 78 shortly after the election, or shortly before it. And so that's number one. You have to have somebody who the voters can see as a potential president. Secondly, Joe has made it clear that, and I think this is right, that they have to be compatible with him. That is, they have to be naturally on the same team. When they're not on the same team, it's not fatal to the presidency, but it's a pain. You're just wasting somebody. Dan Quayle was sort of always put in the closet by Bush. Cheney obviously ruined George W. Bush's presidency by basically taking over the foreign policy, unbeknownst to Junior until he finally figured it out. And so there's a long history. And Lyndon Johnson, interestingly enough, it was probably even though I intensely disliked him, probably the most prolific president in my lifetime in terms of changing the country. So there are lots of examples where the president and the vice president don't get along. It's better if you have a team. So he'll pick somebody that he likes. The next question is the demographic question. Our core constituencies are, 1, people under 35. They vote 68% for the Democrats. Not, by the way, because they're Democrats, but because our platform has a lot to do with environmental protection and diversity. We welcome women's rights and so forth. And so the people your age on our side of the Atlantic, those are really the core issues. For example, they think gay rights is the civil rights issue of their time. And obviously, Trump's party is incredibly hostile to all of those things. So so that's number one. We've got to get the young vote out. 2, people of color are our core constituency. All people of color have been alienated by Trump's anti-immigrant, even Asian Americans, who tended to be somewhat conservative because they often ended up in small businesses, and small businesses don't like regulation, and we're supposedly the party of regulation. But that's all been thrown out because of the incredibly anti-immigrant rhetoric of Trump. And the third is women, who are obviously turned off by Trump's incredible sexism and general assholery, if you'll pardon the expression. So we have to get those people out to vote. There's a lot of talk in America about swing voters, and people used to think that swing voters were people who might vote Republican one time and Democratic the next. It's not true. Swing voters are people who vote one time and don't vote at all the next time, but they don't go back and forth usually between parties. So we have to get our turnout up. If we get our turnout up, we're going to win. If we don't, we're going to lose. And the rest of it really doesn't matter. So now, how do you energize people of color and young people and women? Well, he's checked the women box. That's certainly helpful. That's particularly helpful because women in this country, activist women, feel that they were deprived both in 2008 and in 2016 when Hillary didn't win. And so this is a big deal for them. Young people, where they had a candidate they didn't like, Pete Buttigieg, who did much better, a lot better among older people than younger people. and they did like Bernie Sanders, who's 78 years old also, or something like that. And then people of color. Do you have to have a person of color in order to energize people of color? That's a good question. I don't know what the answer is. You'll get all kinds of answers if you do polling. So all in all, I think, and then there's another argument, which is much more sophisticated, is you better be careful if you pick a senator, because they might be replaced by a Republican. And that would hamper our efforts to take over the Senate, which if I had to predict right now, would be successful, but we have a long way to go. So all in all, I would guess that Gretchen Whitmer would be near the top of the heap. But given Biden's centrism and his particular good relationships with Kamala Harris, who happens to be African-American, and with Klobuchar, I think you have to put them in the top tier as well. There's a couple of Hispanic women that are very well qualified. One is that, although they're both new in where they are, one is a senator from Nevada and the other is a governor from New Mexico. And then there are a number of African-American women that would also be good candidates. And I have absolutely no clue who he's going to pick, although he's said he's going to do it by May 1st, which is Friday.
I'm just going to say that I forgot to announce this at the beginning. If anyone has any questions, do send them to me or Sam so we can feed them to you. I'm just going to continue on the US politics theme. And you mentioned a couple of the candidates. I wondered if you had any specific reflections on the race we've just had. What do you think about Biden being the nominee? And how do, you mentioned that Biden is relatively old and doesn't seem like, or can't mathematically be, the future of the Democratic Party. So where does the party go in 4 years? Or 8 years?
Okay, so taking the questions in reverse order, where the party goes in 4 years, unless Biden is elected and runs in a second term, is somebody from the next generation. And where they're most likely to go is Biden's pick for vice president. Whoever that is, she will be in the mix. So that's certainly one very interesting piece. Secondly, I think that I don't know what Biden's timetable is. I have no way of knowing what he thinks. But the future of the Democratic Party is youth. I mean, we already are about 40% taken over by young people. And interestingly, it's not a turn to the left. For the people getting the papers all the time are AOC and the squad and all that. That's 5 members of the new Congress. 40 people were elected and beat Republicans. The other 35 that you don't read about have served in the military. They're young, and they come from conservative districts in Oklahoma and Texas and central Pennsylvania and Orange County, California. I think the country is moving left and the Democratic Party is moving center. Because I think your generation in our country is going to be much more conservative about money because they had to live through the 2008 recession. So my theory of the case is that whoever the nominee is, young people have already started taking over the party. The fact that Buttigieg was able to do as well as he did at 37 years old and relatively minimal experience says that that this process is well underway. And I think in another 4 years, 2 congressional elections, you're going to see a marked youth to the party. The most interesting, there's 2 photographs that all you have to do is look at without reading anything, and you'll see what's happening to the party. Look at the freshman representative party picture on the steps of the United States Capitol after the 2018 election, and look at the House, the Assembly in Virginia, the House of Delegates picture in Virginia for the freshmen after the 2017 election. They are much younger, they are much darker, and they are much more female. That's the future of the Democratic Party. Our party is young, they're of color, and they're female. And those people are taking over the country. And they're doing it the old-fashioned way from the ground up with grassroots politics. So in terms of what's going to happen in 4 years, it all depends, A, who wins. If Biden wins, this is going to happen anyway, but it'll probably slow down a little bit. And B, how good the on-the-ground organizations outside the Democratic Party is, because they've really been the backbone of, I think, our electoral resurgence at the state level.
I think it'd be quite interesting to hear a little bit about your own experience in running in a presidential race. Um, how much have things changed since 2004, do you think, in terms of campaigning and sort of gathering support from the grassroots?
Well, I mean, everybody, first of all, I'd love to take all the credit for inventing that. And usually my biographies give me credit for it. I don't deserve it. We had no money. We had an unbelievably powerful message. And we basically let the 23-year-olds that volunteered for the campaign do whatever they pleased. I'll give you an example. So this was unheard of. When you're running for president, you're home about a half a day every 2 weeks. So I'd come home and I'd always go to the office to thank everybody because they're working like crazy for next to nothing. And so I'm sitting in the office, about to give a talk and thank all the volunteers. And this 20-something-year-old kid comes up and says, "Excuse me, Governor, could you sit down in front of this computer and have a ham sandwich for lunch?" And I said, "What?" And this was 16 years ago. So they'd rigged up a webcam. In those days, they didn't have these little things that we're looking over to see each other built into the camera. And they were figured out how to live stream things, which was not widely done either. And I had the ham sandwich in front of on live stream. And the purpose was that Dick Cheney, the vice president of the United States, was having a $25,000 a couple lunch in South Carolina at the same time I was having my ham sandwich. He raised $525,000 and we raised $625,000 over a ham sandwich with no $25,000 a couple. So that was all invented by people like Ezra Klein, who are now the editor in Vox. And, most of the players in their 30s started out in my campaign. It was the first campaign for that generation, and they did it their way, and it revolutionized everything. And I wish I could tell you I was so smart. I was so smart because of only one reason. I let them do whatever they wanted. And if they could explain what a good thing to do was, they did it. And we had no money, so I let them fail too on plenty of things. And it was just a really fun experience. It's unbelievably hard work. I mean, there's nothing more grinding than a presidential campaign in the United States. It goes on forever. Everybody's not nice. Our press behaves like yours, which is basically mostly not nice. And it's really hard. But it basically pulled a whole new generation into politics. And they're still there, and they're about to take over the Democratic Party and about to take over the country.
On the subject of cruel press treatments, obviously it would be remiss if I didn't mention the notorious Scream.
The "I have a Scream" speech.
Yes. Did you ever wonder whether the Scream would actually sort of benefit you in the modern climate where people really sort of prize authenticity above all else? And they really
I don't think it would necessarily benefit me, but I don't think. Well, the Scream was a product of the cable. I'm sure you know the story that there was 1,500 kids in the room, and nobody could hear anything. No, there were 75 print reporters. Not one of them wrote about it. Because what the cable stations is plug it directly into the mult box, and so you never heard the kids. So it sounded like I wouldn't have voted for me either if I'd seen that video. But it actually had nothing to do with my losing. What really happened is I was supposed to come in first in Iowa, and we were poorly organized, and I came in third in Iowa. And when that happens, you're in big trouble. And that's actually what happened to Hillary Clinton in her race. She was supposed to come in first, and she came in third behind Barack Obama and John Edwards, and that was the end of that. So I don't know what would have. I mean, everything is would have, could have, should have. I think the thing I care about the most is A, it was an unbelievably personal growth experience, but B, it ushered a new generation, which is going to change, which is in the process of changing the country into politics. But I don't spend a lot of time thinking about what if and what would be different or any of that sort of thing.
Speaking of sort of revolutionary campaigns, I think it would be difficult to not talk about Donald Trump's relationship with the media and how he sort of changed how the media, his relationship with the media, and in fact how many would claim the media got him at least the nomination. So what do you think that means for the future of campaigning, both in the States but across the world for the next 10 years?
Well, it's hard to say. Obviously, Trump is part of a wave of authoritarians in office. I would say certainly we'll see if Johnson's COVID experience has changed this of anybody, but he was really in the Trump mold. Modi is the same. Orban, Kaczynski, with his puppet Duda, who's about to be reelected by a wide margin. And this stuff is going on all over the place. Bolsonaro in Brazil. So I haven't quite figured out why this is a worldwide phenomenon, other than people, I think democracies got tired, people got greedy, people started thinking about themselves instead of their countries, and the public got tired and wanted to change. So that was part of it. Part of it is that Trump is, first of all, he's not very smart, and second of all, he's obviously an asshole, but he's very good with the media, and the media made him president of the United States. And now they're all complaining and moaning and groaning and running away as fast as they can. The New York Times was incredibly helpful to Trump because they held him to a different standard. Why? Because he was great clickbait and he made them all a lot of money. Two talk show hosts, Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski, had him on in his bathrobe on the phone every morning on their talk show host. They wouldn't do that for anybody else, but they did it for him. So the media is very much culpable in getting Trump elected. But in fairness, there was this backlash, and a lot of it has to do with the change in the world and division in the world into people who know how to use the internet and people who don't. The truth is, I mean, our Midwest is not very different than your Midlands. If you lose your job and you're a 55-year-old white guy, you're not getting another one unless you know how to use the internet, unless you have a college education, not a high school education. I mean, look at the Midlands in England. It's just shocking. And in some ways worse than the Midwest, and that's where labor lost their support after having it for years and years and years. I think that's partly all of our fault that you might consider elite. That we built this incredible infrastructure, and the young people led the way, but we didn't do much about the people who were rapidly being left behind for educational and cultural reasons. The other problem is the conservatism of small towns. People choose not to come to London or big cities because they like to be where they are, because they're comfortable with their way of being. And all of a sudden they see these people who are of different colors, different religions. They see two men being able to marry each other. I mean, this is just a terrible shock to people my parents' age who didn't have educations. That's with the Republican parties. They're basically a bunch of 65-year-old white people that are terrified of the future. Fortunately, our telomeres are getting shorter and shorter, so that group dies off and the next one comes along. I fall into that category, but fortunately I don't live in some of those places, and chose to have a different kind of life. In fact, I was the first, you may know, I was the first governor in the United States to sign a same-sex marriage bill, and I was happy to do it. Although it scared the hell out of me and I had to wear a bulletproof vest for the summer. So the change, I think there's a lot of that change. I mean, Poland is about to reelect a fascist president, or a president who's who is cooperating with a fascist government and undermining the judiciary. Why is that? Because they're conservative, because they don't like foreigners, they don't like the idea of immigration. I mean, I was shocked to find that what was apparently driving, I figured, okay, there's plenty of bigotry. I did a year of school in England on an English-speaking union scholarship. There was plenty of bigotry against South Asians and so forth, and people from the Commonwealth. I was shocked to find that most of the bigotry in the Brexit election had to do with Poles. I couldn't believe it. And I actually think that Blair, who obviously has discredited himself as a result of what went on in his lies about Iraq, but I thought that Blair made a great decision when he allowed the immigrants to come in right away after the Big Bang in the EU. And the British economy did much better as a result. And the Poles came in and they worked their asses off, and they undercut some of the other people who weren't working quite so hard. That's how you regenerate a nation. That's how you make nations great, is getting people in who are willing to work. And then the backlash, of course, was Brexit, egged on by the right wing and by political opportunists like your prime minister. So this is going on all over the world. I do think that the media facilitates it because it's good clickbait. And, there is a part of our species, unfortunately, that likes florid, outrageous news all the time. And if you can provide florid, outrageous news, such as likening people in burqas to mailboxes, I suppose that gets printed even even in papers that are supposedly decent.
We have one question from Anna. Obviously, for 4 years, you were the chair of the DNC, and the DNC has come under a lot of criticism, particularly from the left of the Democratic Party, who view it as a sort of corrupt elite that, bypasses the democratic process. Do you think the DNC is in need of any reform? Do you think it does need to be improved in any ways?
Absolutely. Well, when I was running the DNC, I was the candidate from outside Washington. All the inside Washington people tried to make sure I didn't win. And I really built a grassroots operation. When I came into the DNC, the Republicans controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency. When I left 4 years later, we controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency. When I left, as is often what happens is when you have the presidency, your own party tends to wither because you use it as a re-elect model for yourself. Our presidency, as you know, does not depend on having majorities in Congress, unlike yours or your prime ministership. So, and there was also some very unfortunate personnel mistakes that they made. So there is a backlash against the DNC. I think it's being rebuilt, but it's being rebuilt very slowly. So it has a ways to go. But our DNC is not as essential to the future of elections as say, the Labor or the Conservative Party might be. What really happens is what goes on in the grassroots. For the first 2 years after we lost in 2016, I, with 4 other people my age, funded organizations of young people that were outside the DNC because we thought what they were doing, if you added them all up, subscribed all the functions of the DNC and did so much more efficiently and much more appealing to your age group. So I think the DNC will gradually be taken over by people your age, but I think, frankly, what's really happened is it's just been bypassed and ignored. So I think the people that whine and moan about the DNC are basically Bernie people who, are unsatisfied no matter what. I mean, most of Bernie's supporters are young, idealistic people who want social justice, but there's also an element of the hard left 60s who basically whine and moan about everything and secretly don't want to win, so they don't have to get their hands dirty and make any compromises. And you're never going to please those people. So I don't worry a lot about criticism of the DNC. I think their biggest accusation you can make about them is that they're ineffective, and I do think they're getting better.
Speaking about your time at the DNC, you're quite famous for pursuing a 50-state strategy, and not leaving any state behind, to co-opt a phrase. So with more and more Democrats potentially talking both about purple states, but also about potentially letting states go that are quote unquote unwinnable, do you still think that a 50-state strategy would benefit the Democrats today?
I think it's absolutely essential. I think you have to, there's 2 reasons. You have to compete everywhere. If you don't, then the right wing gets to give you the Democratic message, which is not going to be terribly flattering. Secondly, most people want to hear from both sides. So I used to go to all those areas of Vermont when I was running for governor multiple times where I knew I wasn't going to win, but I'd go for 2 reasons. First of all, anger for asking somebody for their vote is a sign of respect, even if they're not going to give it to you. So you'd go, you'd ask, they wouldn't give it to you, but they would feel respected that you came and spent the time. Anger is one of the most motivating factors there is in getting to the polls. That's why one of the reasons Trump was so effective in getting people out. And so you disarm people by giving your message and being their next door neighbor and saying who you are. I mean, basically saying who you are is critical. It's how the gay rights movement succeeded. Is people who were in the closet for years finally stood up and said who they were. And guess what? They were not such bad people after all. They were human beings, and that began to change the whole view of whether people deserved equal rights under the law, no matter who you were. And the same is true of the civil rights movement. So we need to be everywhere. And the other thing is, it takes time to rebuild movements. You have to keep at it. And you've got to start at the local level. In fact, the liberal Democrats were actually quite successful in local governments. The reason they got a chance in the election where Gordon Brown and Cameron were in was because they'd done a good job in local elections at the local level, and people said, well, let's give them a try now that we're dissatisfied with both other parties. So that is how you win. The way I would do it if I were a liberal Democrat, I don't think I'd start with the big elections, and they only happen every 5 years anyway. You can't afford to wait. I'd get down and run 5,000 people in all the city council races. And every time there's a by-election, be sure you have a liberal Democrat. And then sooner or later, people are going to get tired of the alternatives and they're going to vote for you. And then they're going to discover that the liberal Democrats, in fact, are viable people who can run things and do a good job in local government. So that's why you have a 50-state strategy, even in the most difficult areas.
You mentioned Bernie Sanders earlier. When I was researching for this, I dug up a few headlines from the 2004 election, where often, if you read it blind, you would potentially think it was talking about Bernie Sanders in 2016, a sort of Vermont politician running from the left, posing a threat to the party establishment. But of course, you've never really you've never endorsed Bernie Sanders, I think, for the presidency.
Right.
So what do you see as being the biggest differences between you and him?
Well, Bernie is basically a 60s lefty, and I'm not. I was in college at that time. I learned to distrust the hard left when I was in college. I found them incredibly sexist. I found them insincere. I found them, they all had litmus tests. And if you didn't agree with them on every single thing, then you were worthless. So I just is unattractive. They're doctrinaire. I actually spent my time at university studying existentialism and Marxism. And the two are similar in this way. If you read Marx, which is actually quite interesting in all of it, you finally get down to this phrase, and the state shall wither away. And it pops the entire Marxist philosophy, which is, wait a minute, you got to a place where you have this workers' nirvana, but you have a state. How do you get rid of it? The state shall wither away. The same is true in existentialism. I read everything from Kierkegaard on up through Nietzsche and Sartre finally, who was the last iteration. And Sartre's great work was on being and nothingness. And at the end so he goes through all this thing about a solipsistic world, and then the question is posed at the end: how do you know you exist in a solipsistic world? And the whole thing is the look. That is, you look into somebody's eyes, and you know there's another person there. And I thought, holy cow, the whole thing is just bullshit. You get through all these explanations in a century and a half of great thinkers who went to wonderful universities all over Europe, and then it's condensed to these two nonsensical phrases that supposedly explain the logical extension of their entire philosophy, and the whole thing came collapsing down. So I have very little patience with ideology, almost none, because I think ideology avoids facts, and I think facts is what should drive everything. Now, we can have different views about what to do about the facts. That's fine. And we can have principles, and I think Sanders' principles are mostly right, that people should be treated decently, that we should have equality, that nobody in a wealthy Western nation should ever be faced with starvation or lack of health care. Those are principles. How you get there, however, is completely, it need not be ideological. And on the hard left, it's always ideological. One of the reasons I couldn't stand Corbyn. One of the many reasons I couldn't stand Corbyn.
Speaking about potentially more modern issues, about right now, obviously, the whole world is battling the coronavirus crisis. You've mentioned Johnson, we've mentioned Trump. What do you think has gone wrong potentially in the States and the UK to have such high incidence of cases? And, if you were president, how would you be handling this differently?
Well, the problem is, at this point, first of all, this president is crazy, and he's an irrelevant person, really. And he corrupts his scientists because he only gets the ones with backbones made out of jelly, with the exception of Fauci, who but I don't pay any attention to anything Trump says or any of his people. Not that they're all bad, but they're all either bad or afraid of him. And Trump is terribly threatened by competence of any sort. So to ask what would you do now is, the only real answer to that is, what would you have done 3 months ago? It really started a long time ago when Trump got rid of the the pandemic squad that was at the CDC. And then it proceeded when Trump got rid of the delegation in China that was working with the Chinese version of the CDC, embedded with them, so that the warning that we had about the virus was much later than it should have been. You couldn't have had an outcome different than the one we have now, without having kept in place the things that Obama had going on. And once you get rid of those, then we are at risk, and it's just a question of when this was going to happen. And then the other obvious fumbling is Trump's psychiatric diseases, which prevent him from being a chief executive of any substance at all. He can't make decisions. He makes the wrong decisions. He prescribes drugs to people who then ingest bleach and all these kind of things. And this guy is a lunatic. So that it never helps. But luckily, we have a very diverse system. So the governors are actually stepping up. Governors of both parties, including some I disagree with everything on, have done actually quite a good job for the most part, doing what has to be done. The biggest problem of all now, playing catch up, is testing. We really should be testing hundreds of thousands of people every single day. You need a baseline of who has the virus and who doesn't, and what's happened to the people who've had it and recovered. And we don't know who had it and recovered because we didn't test them for the longest time, because there were no tests, because Trump has corrupted all the health organizations. The CDC used to be probably the most respected health organization in the world, and now it's relatively useless. The scientists are still good, but the head of the CDC, of course, is corrupted by Trump because he's afraid of him. They're not serving their countries well by being afraid of a lunatic. What would I do now? I would first of all, I would screen out the 17 companies identified by the New York Times as total hoaxes when it comes to the testing. And I'd put a hell of a lot of money into get testing as many people as I could, whether they're symptomatic or not, so that we could build a baseline of who gets exposed and what their symptoms are. I'm convinced the death rate is much lower in this disease than we suspect, because I suspect that as many as 30% of the population in places like New York have had coronavirus and may not have even known it. So that's the big thing. Then we have to do contact tracing. I mean, there's a whole public health approach to this, which was developed over a period of years, and it was let go by a megalomaniac who doesn't know anything.
Angus asks about campaign finance in the United States. So obviously here in the UK, we have much stricter laws. Should campaign finance reform happen in the States? It
has to. I mean, what you've had is that we have a corrupt Supreme Court. 63% of people under 35 believe the Supreme Court takes politics into consideration before they consider the law, and I believe they're right. So the United States is really quite in some danger, because people don't think the court system works for them. They think it's been padded by the Republicans, and they're right. Huge sums of money have been funneled into getting the people on the Supreme Court who are there today so they can do the bidding of the funders, which are usually gigantic corporations, which are not required to say who they are. The amount of money, I mean, the United States, I think the United States is never going to be the most indispensable nation again. And I actually think it's in danger of failing. If Trump is reelected, I think the United States is actually in some danger of splitting apart, because it's just extraordinary corruption. The Republicans should have called out Trump a long time ago. When I was growing up, if we'd had a president like Trump, the Republicans would have stopped him from behaving like this. But they're totally bought and paid for, other than Mitt Romney. They're terrified of him. There are some decent Republicans, but they're not decent enough to have the courage to stand up for what's right, again, with the exception of Romney. So I think we're in much more trouble than we think. And I think the campaign finance reform, Citizens United, has really opened the doors to legalize corruption, of which we have a huge amount of. People don't think of the United States as being corrupt because we've just legalized the corruption. I've done a tremendous amount of work in Ukraine and places like that. And I was once there before Yanukovych was kicked out, talking to his chief of staff, who was wonderful, actually. She was 6 feet tall. She was a professor of politics at the university. She only lasted a year because she was honest, and those people weren't welcome in Yanukovych's presidency. So I was talking to her about some of the problems Ukraine was having. And I said, well, first of all, if you want to try Tymoshenko, you can't do it in Ukraine because nobody's going to believe in an emerging democracy that if you try your political opponent, it's about the law. So send her to the European court and have them try her or charge her, and if that will be believed. The results will be believed, but they won't be believed. Of course, they didn't pay any attention to that. And then we were talking about what to do about the Russians. I said, I warned them that what was going to happen in the eastern Ukraine was going to happen, and she didn't seem to care about that, or didn't say much about it, probably because Yanukovych was already in bed with Putin by that time. And then finally I said, you really got to figure out what to do about oligarchs running political parties. And then I stopped and I laughed and I said, oh, Madam Chief of Staff, I can't give you this part of my lecture because it's now legal in the United States for oligarchs to run political parties. And that's exactly what's happened in the United States.
So you've spoken at length about the future of the Democratic Party. You touched there on the Republicans, and I'm interested to hear, do you think Trump will be a bit of a blip and Republicans will go?
No, I think the Republicans are dead for a while. I have some very conservative friends who used to be reliable Republicans who are not going to vote for Trump. In fact, I think they're going to vote for Biden. Trump is not a conservative. Trump is just an autocrat who's, a corrupt autocrat who does whatever is best for his wallet. And the Republicans have completely trashed themselves in the eyes of young people. They have nothing to offer them except being elderly white people who don't like women or minorities, which is, of course, the future of the country. So I think they're screwed. I think their only chance is to have some sort of authoritarian government, which I think they'd be most happy with. I think the Republican Party is either unprincipled or completely lacks courage. And I make no exceptions for that other than Romney's vote. I have some friends over there in the House that I actually liked and helped. But I wouldn't bother with them now. I just think what they've done to the country is appalling, and they've done it for all the wrong reasons.
On that topic, Anna's asked an interesting question. So in 2016, we heard a lot about these never Trumpers. Do you think they're a real force?
Yeah, I do. I think they're going to run some very unhelpful ads for Trump, calling him out on his dishonesty. And I think they're not a lot of them, but every vote's going to matter. And so, I think they're not. I like the Never Trumpers because they're sort of honest conservatives. And I think you can have a debate with conservatives, with honest conservatives, about what the right thing to do is. I mean, we're not right all the time on our side of the aisle, and our philosophy is not always the right one. And sometimes Republicans make good points, and we should work with each other. But you can't work with people who are corrupt. And the Never Trumpers are not. The Never Trumpers are Republicans who have the courage of their convictions and are willing to stand up for what they think is right for their country. And I never have a problem with that. I have a problem with conniving politicians who are really in it for themselves, but I don't have a problem with honest people that I have disagreements with.
And related to that, what do you think went wrong in 2016? Was Clinton a weak candidate, or?
She was, yeah, I happen to be very close to her and like her a lot. In fact, the reason I didn't endorse Bernie in 2008 or 2012 was because, 2000, wait a minute, which he ran twice and I didn't endorse him. Okay, that's right, 2016. I didn't endorse him in 2016 because I recruited Hillary. I had written op-ed pieces for her and papers and so forth, and endorsed her way before I thought Bernie was going to run. I didn't know Bernie was going to run. And she would have been an incredible president. But you have to be willing to campaign hard, and you have to be able to connect with people. Intellectually, she has a mind that's better than almost anybody I know in politics, but she doesn't have a particularly political mind. And I also think she was poorly served in ways. They took a lot for granted. They never thought Trump could possibly win because he's such a doofus. But he did, partly because of our ridiculous electoral system, partly because Hillary didn't appeal to young people as much as I was hoping. So it wasn't a particularly good campaign. The press was terrible. I mean, the New York Times, which was the greatest paper in the world, so after Rupert took over the Times of London, which used to be the greatest English language speaking paper in the world, the New York Times inherited that mantle, and they completely collapsed. I mean, they were writing about uranium mine deals in Canada with the Russians that never happened, and all these email crap, which was totally manufactured, and they went right along with it. And so it was sort of a confluence of bad things that happened all at once, which enabled an incompetent, crazy person to become president of the United States.
Becky's asked, going back to the campaign for president that happened this cycle, the primaries, sorry, why didn't Cory Booker do better? And I think you can apply that to a lot of candidates.
I don't know. The only comments that I heard was, I want a politician, not a preacher. You know, I don't know anything about the insides of his campaign, so I can't tell you about that. He did raise some money. He certainly was credible, but he just didn't seem to connect with enough people that would give him the oxygen. It's also, he was not a household name. And if you have a field of 25 people, it's very hard to get ahead. And, you know, he just didn't seem to be the person who people focused on from that generation. I mean, there were other young candidates, there were other African-American and minority candidates. And so he just wasn't the one that came to the fore.
And speaking of being a household name, do you think the debate rules, especially in the early stage of the campaign, were fair, or would they have prevented candidates like yourself in 2004 from actually getting a foothold?
I think they were fair. I think what you didn't want to have is a junior varsity. And you didn't want to have 12 people on the stage as the Republicans did. So I don't know what else you could have done. But, you know, having more than 6 or 8 people on the stage at a single time is a disaster, as the Republicans proved. And I think relegating one half, you know, the lowest half in the polls to the junior varsity is denigrating and is worse than what we did. So there may be some tune-ups, but if you have a field that's big, I don't see what choices you have. The other problem is that from the inside, I can tell you why I supported it. I had to preside over an election where there were actually 9 candidates, and 2 or 3 of them didn't raise any money, didn't care. They just wanted to get up and talk and bloviate on the stage, and former senators and people like that. I didn't see any particular obligation that if you weren't going to be serious and run. I mean, you can put your name on the New Hampshire primary ballot by writing a check for $1,000. You don't even have to have a single signature to get on. So there's about 350 people that run in the New Hampshire primary. But, you know, we don't all put them on the debate stage because obviously it'd be unworkable. So, I mean, my view is if you can think of a different criteria that we can use to short the serious candidates out of the not so serious candidates, tell me what they are. I actually think 2 people did very, very well in that format. One was Andrew Yang, and the other was Cory Booker. And was Pete Buttigieg. And they really earned themselves a place by being unusual, running a good campaign, and they stayed in quite late. And I thought that was worth something.
Okay, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask you a couple of quicker questions. Zachary asks, if we're looking at the 2020 election, what are some Senate seats, or maybe even House seats, we should be really paying attention to?
Okay, I can't do the House seats because I don't have them in my head, and we're mostly playing defense there. We could continue with a 40-seat majority, I think would be great. Maine, Iowa, New Hampshire, North Carolina. We have a shot in Texas. That's probably our least likely of the ones. Arizona is a good one. Colorado is another one. Alabama is a hold, and that'll be very hard for us. That would be off the top of my head. Kansas, we have a very good shot in Kansas, especially if Kobach gets the nomination. If he doesn't, we probably don't have a shot, but if he does, I think we have a very good shot.
And Danny's asking about marijuana and marijuana legalization. A lot of progress has been made towards that. Where do you think that should be going over the next couple of years?
I think eventually it'll be legalized for the country. I mean, we have this patchwork of laws now. It's not entirely clear why we haven't legalized it already. I mean, it's legalized in a bunch of different states. It's mostly been decriminalized. I mean, my view of this is, when I was governor, I was always against legalization for 2 reasons. The first was I figured we had enough trouble with cigarettes and alcohol, and why invite more? And the second was that the people who were for legalization were trying to backdoor it by pretending it should be legalized as a medicine. And they didn't have any studies that proved that. And I can't stand people who rationalize things and make cases that's all bullshit. I mean, that's a lawyer's trick, not a doctor's trick. So I was against it. I became for it when my daughter became a public defender, and basically drew my attention to all the minority kids who were poor and caught with a single joint, and then their lives were ruined because they could never get a job. So that flipped me immediately on legalization of marijuana, because after all, it's probably safer than alcohol, except for teens, which it apparently does lead to cognitive defects over time, or can. So I flipped on that, and then there was more medical evidence to support that CBD and possibly THC were helpful in certain medical conditions. So I basically changed my views on it. And I think it's silly to throw people in jail for using a drug that's probably less harmful than alcohol.
Okay, thank you very much. I know you have to run, so I'm going to end this now, because I know a lot of people are going to go watch a union event now. But thank you very much for joining us.
Who's debating at the union?
Beto O'Rourke's giving a talk.
Fantastic. Give it my best.
Yes. Thank you very much for talking to us and answering all our questions.
Thank you all. Good luck in that. Good luck in that regional coalition with labor or something else. If we ever do this again, I want to take 5 minutes to get you to explain to me how you're going to bring your party back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.